The wind howled across the dusty plains as the young man stood before her door, his jaw tight, his hands trembling. Everyone in the village whispered her name with fear, the widow who had buried 2 husbands and was said to keep death itself at her side. Yet he had no choice. His mother lay inside their home, pale and fading, and the healer demanded payment far beyond what he could give. So he struck a bargain with fate itself. To save his mother, he would marry the most feared widow in the village. The wedding was not a celebration, but a storm. Neighbors gathered in silence, their eyes filled with pity for the boy and dread for the woman cloaked in black. She stood tall, her veil hiding a face that needed no mask. Her reputation was enough. Whispers claimed she had poisoned her first husband, driven the second into ruin, and now waited like a hawk for her next prey. Yet she spoke no defense, nor sought affection. She simply accepted his vow with a gaze as sharp as a blade. For him, every step toward her was a step away from his own freedom. But love for his mother outweighed fear of the widow. He thought he was sacrificing himself to darkness, trading hope for survival. Still, somewhere deep inside, he wondered, was she truly a monster, or only a woman shaped by grief and the cruel judgments of a village eager to feed on rumor? The answer was hidden behind her silence, a silence that cut sharper than any insult. The first night beneath the same roof was colder than the desert at midnight. She spoke little, her presence heavy, her footsteps echoing through the house like warnings. Yet there were no chains, no cruelty, only a distance that left him restless. He listened to her movements, wondering if the whispers were true, wondering if he would live long enough to see his mother's strength return. And still, in the quiet, he could not help but notice the way she lingered by the fire, staring into it as though searching for something long lost. Thus began a tale not of love at first sight, but of sacrifice, suspicion, and secrets buried in the dust of the Old West. A young man who gambled his future to save his mother, and a widow feared by all, bound together not by choice, but by necessity. And while the world around them watched with dread, neither could imagine how their story, born in fear and shadow, would one day unravel truths far greater than the lies whispered across the village. The days after their marriage were filled with silence heavier than gunpowder. The young man rose early to tend to the horses, to fetch water, to keep himself busy enough not to notice the weight of her presence. She, the widow cloaked in black, moved through the house like a shadow. She neither demanded nor comforted, yet her silence held power, the kind that made the neighbor's whispers seem louder every time he stepped outside. To the village, he was a fool doomed by desperation. To himself, he was a son clinging to the last thread of hope. Each evening, he returned to find her seated near the fire, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on the flames as though she saw ghosts dancing within them. The villagers called her cursed, but sitting across from her, he wondered if what haunted her was not death, but memory. The air between them was tense, but not cruel. It was as though both carried wounds too deep for words, wounds that could not be stitched by promises. The nights were the hardest. He lay awake, hearing the old wood creak under her steps, the soft opening of drawers, the occasional long sigh that cut through the silence. Fear gripped him still, fear that she might confirm the rumors, that his life would end as swiftly as the men before him. Yet alongside the fear was something stranger, curiosity. He wanted to know who she really was beneath the veil of dread that cloaked her. His mother's health began to show the faintest signs of improvement. The healer, satisfied with the price paid, provided herbs that steadied her breathing and returned a touch of color to her cheeks. The young man's heart eased at the sight, but relief was shadowed by the knowledge of what he had traded for it. His future now belonged to a woman feared by all. Still, he could not deny the truth forming in the silence of that house. The widow had not raised her hand against him, nor spoken words meant to harm. Her power was in absence, in restraint, in a distance that unsettled him more than cruelty ever could. He began to wonder, was it fear that kept her distant, or was it grief the village had mistaken for malice? One evening, after a long day spent repairing fences under the blistering sun, he returned to find her outside the house, her veil lifted for the first time. Her face, illuminated by the dying light, bore no trace of wickedness, only weariness, deep lines carved by loss, and eyes too tired to conceal their sorrow. She did not notice him at first, and for a moment he saw the widow not as the villagers had painted her, but as a woman carrying the weight of something unspoken. When she realized he was watching, she quickly pulled the veil back down, her posture stiffening as though she had been caught revealing a secret. "Why do you stare?" she asked, her voice sharp, though it trembled at the edges. He swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. "Because I don't think you are what they say," he replied. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he braced for anger. Yet instead of fury, she turned away, her silence thicker than before. That night, she left a bowl of stew for him on the table. It was the first gesture she had made since their marriage that resembled care, and though no words accompanied it, the meaning was not lost on him. Actions, he realized, spoke louder than both rumors and silence. For the first time, he wondered if her fearsome reputation was less about truth and more about survival, a shield she had learned to wear in a world that punished women for their grief. Still, trust was not easily won. He carried his doubts, just as she carried hers. In the village, eyes followed them with suspicion, whispers sharpened into warnings. Some men muttered that he would not live to see another season. Others claimed she would soon inherit his land as she had before. Each word clawed at him, but when he returned home, the quiet strength of her presence slowly eroded those fears. She did not seek his harm, but neither did she seek his closeness. And so the days stretched on, bound by unspoken truths and unanswered questions. He had married her for his mother's sake, but with each passing moment, the mystery of the widow deepened. Was she truly the villain whispered about across the village, or was she a soul as wounded as he, fighting for survival in a land where grief was as common as dust? The answer, he felt, would shape not just his marriage, but his very future. The third week of their uneasy union brought with a night that neither would forget. A storm rolled across the plains, rattling the house as though the very sky wanted to tear it apart. Rain lashed the windows, thunder shook the walls, and in the midst of it, his mother's coughing grew violent, her frail body trembling under the weight of sickness that no healer's herbs could completely cure. He rushed to her side, panic rising in his chest, unsure if she would survive the night. To his surprise, the widow was there before him, kneeling at his mother's bedside, her hands steady as she prepared a mixture of herbs and warm water. Her movements were quick, practiced, almost instinctive. She did not speak, but her focus was unyielding, as though the storm outside did not exist. When the coughing subsided and his mother's breathing eased, he finally looked at the widow with different eyes. For the first time, he saw not a shadowed figure cloaked in fear, but a protector, one who knew how to face suffering without flinching. When the storm quieted, he found her standing by the window, her silhouette outlined by lightning in the distance. "You've done this before," he said softly. She did not turn to face him, but her voice carried the weight of a story she would not tell. "I have buried more than you can imagine," she answered, "and I have learned how to fight death, even when it refuses to listen." Her words were not cold, but heavy, as though each syllable carried the memory of loss. The young man felt a shift within himself. The fear that had clung to him since their wedding night began to loosen its grip. He no longer saw her as the widow who devoured husbands, but as a woman marked by grief, fighting desperately against the cruelty of fate. The villagers' whispers suddenly seemed shallow compared to the truth written in her silence. That night, as the rain finally gave way to calm, he understood something new. She was not feared because she was cruel, but because she had endured more than most could bear. And endurance, in the Old West, often looked like something dangerous to those who had never faced it themselves. The following days carried a fragile peace between them. They no longer lived as strangers under one roof, but as two people bound by unspoken understanding. He noticed small changes: the way she left water ready for him after long hours in the fields, the way she checked his mother's health without being asked. These were not gestures of affection, but of responsibility, of honor. And in the Old West, honor was worth more than love spoken too easily. Still, the village would not let them rest. Rumors grew louder, sharper, as if the storm had stirred more than just dust. Some claimed she was only waiting for the right moment to strike. Others said he had been bewitched. The young man carried these words like stones in his chest, but every time he returned home, the silence of their house spoke louder. She had not harmed him, nor his mother. She lived her days with a quiet strength that rumors could not shake. One evening, while repairing a broken fence, he confronted her. "Why do you let them believe the worst of you?" he asked, frustration bleeding into his voice. She stood in the doorway, her veil lifted, her expression unreadable. "Because fighting lies is like chasing smoke," she replied. "It only burns you and leaves the air no clearer." Her words cut deep, for he realized she had chosen to bear the weight of rumor rather than waste her life trying to silence it. He saw then the depth of her isolation, a woman condemned not by her deeds but by the fear of others. And yet, she had not grown bitter, not entirely. Her silence was not weakness. It was a shield, a way to survive when the world had already decided her story without ever asking for the truth. That night, as he lay awake listening to the steady rhythm of her footsteps, he felt something stirring within him. What began as a marriage of sacrifice was slowly becoming something else, something he did not yet have the courage to name. She was still the widow feared by the village, but to him, she was becoming something far more dangerous, a mystery worth unraveling. The turning point came one blistering afternoon when the young man stumbled back from the fields, sweat dripping, his hands torn from endless labor. He expected to find the widow in her usual silence, distant and unyielding, but instead she was outside, sleeves rolled up, repairing the chicken coop with a hammer in hand. The sight startled him. The most feared woman in the village, the one who carried a shadow larger than her frame, was bent to simple work like any other soul fighting to survive. He watched her for a moment, then wordlessly joined. They worked side by side, each blow of the hammer echoing louder than words could. She did not chase him away, nor did she scold him for watching. Instead, she allowed the quiet rhythm of shared labor to fill the air. It was the first time he felt something fragile, not trust, not affection, but the faintest spark of companionship. And in the Old West, companionship was as rare as water in a drought. That evening, as they sat near the fire, she surprised him by speaking first. "They say I am cursed," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the flames. "Do you believe them?" He hesitated, the weight of the village pressing on his chest. "I believe curses are nothing compared to the cruelty of men," he answered softly. She turned her gaze toward him, her eyes shimmering not with malice, but with something far more haunting, sorrow. For the first time, she shared a fragment of her story. Her first husband had been kind, but he fell to fever in the harsh winter. Her second was cruel, and though she endured his fists in silence, the day he died in an accident, the village decided it was her doing. From that day on, she became the widow of whispers, the woman cloaked in fear. "It is easier to be hated than pitied," she said quietly. Her words sank into him like a bullet, leaving a wound he could not ignore. That night, he lay awake, no longer haunted by fear of what she might do, but by the injustice of what had been done to her. For the first time, he began to see that his marriage, born out of sacrifice, might yet hold a truth far greater than he imagined. As the weeks stretched into months, the young man found himself transformed by the rhythm of their shared survival. He no longer entered the house with dread, but with the quiet expectation of her presence, the sound of her careful steps, the soft clatter of pots, the steady gaze that now met his without hostility. Their lives, once two strangers bound by necessity, began to weave together in subtle ways neither dared to name. The village still whispered, of course. They always would. But he no longer carried those whispers like stones. When he looked at her, he saw not the monster they feared, but a woman who had borne more grief than most could endure. He saw her tending to his mother with patience, working beside him without complaint, and holding her silence not as cruelty, but as strength. And though he did not say it aloud, he began to feel a fierce pride in the woman others despised. One night, as the moon rose high above the plains, he found her standing outside, staring at the horizon as though waiting for something that would never come. He approached quietly, his heart pounding with unspoken words. "You are not what they say," he whispered. She turned, her veil lifted, her face pale in the moonlight. "And you are not the fool they think you are," she replied. For the first time, a faint smile touched her lips, fragile as glass, but real. That moment stayed with him long after the night had passed. It was not love yet, not the kind sung about in ballads or whispered by firelight, but it was something deeper, recognition. They were both outcasts in their own way, scarred by loss and shaped by sacrifice. In each other, they had found not salvation, but understanding. And sometimes, understanding was stronger than love. By the time the next season rolled across the land, their silence had changed. It was no longer heavy with fear, but filled with unspoken trust. They had not chosen each other out of desire, nor out of chance, but out of necessity. And yet, in that necessity, they had uncovered a truth neither had dared hope for. That even in the most feared widow and the desperate son, there could be a bond stronger than the whispers of the West. It was not long before the bond they had built was tested. One morning, the young man returned from the fields to find two villagers at his door, their faces twisted with contempt. They demanded to see him alone, warning that the widow was dangerous and that he should rid himself of her before it was too late. Their words dripped with malice, each rumor sharpened like a blade. He listened in silence, his jaw tightening as they spat accusations that she had bewitched him, that she was cursed, that sooner or later she would bury him as she had the others. Inside the house, the widow heard everything. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wooden table, her breath shallow as their words reopened wounds she had long tried to bury. When the young man returned, she was already preparing to leave, her belongings gathered in silence. "It is better this way," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They will never see me as anything but death, and you will suffer for standing beside me." Her eyes carried the resignation of someone who had lived too long in shadows. But he would not allow her to slip away. "I did not marry you to abandon you," he said firmly, his voice carrying the steady weight of truth. "I married you for my mother, but I stay because I see who you are, and I will not let their lies decide our lives." His words startled her, cutting through the despair she had carried like a cloak. For the first time, she saw not pity in his eyes, but defiance, not against her, but against the world that had condemned her unjustly. The villagers' threats grew louder in the weeks that followed. Men watched him with suspicion, women whispered behind their hands, children avoided their path in the street. Yet the young man stood taller, his gaze unflinching, and by his side, the widow began to feel something she thought she had lost forever: dignity. It was not the whispers that mattered now, but the way he looked at her, as if she were more than the lies, more than the grief, more than the curse they spoke of. In the stillness of the prairie nights, she began to believe in something she never dared to imagine, that perhaps she was not doomed to be feared, but chosen to be seen. And in his unwavering stance, she found her own strength returning, fiercer than before. The tension with the village reached its peak when a fire broke out in the barn of a local rancher. Fingers pointed instantly at the widow, voices crying out that her curse had struck again. The mob gathered, torches in hand, demanding that she be cast out once and for all. Fear spread through the town like wildfire, and the young man knew that if he did nothing, they would destroy her, not for what she had done, but for what they believed she was. He stood before them, unarmed, his voice steady though his heart thundered in his chest. "If you want her gone, you will have to go through me," he declared. The villagers jeered, calling him blind, bewitched, a fool. Yet his defiance did not waver. "You call her cursed because it is easier than facing your own cruelty. She has harmed no one. You will not make her your scapegoat." The words echoed across the square, silencing even the loudest accusers. The widow watched from the doorway, her breath caught in her throat. No one had ever defended her before, not once in all the years of whispers and fear. She felt the weight of tears she had long refused to shed pressing against her eyes. In that moment, she realized that his vow was not born of obligation, nor pity, but of something pure, the courage to see her truth when no one else dared. The mob dispersed slowly, unsettled by his conviction, though their whispers did not fade entirely. Yet the fire that had threatened to consume her spirit had been extinguished by his words. For the first time in years, she felt what it meant to be more than the widow, more than the fear, more than the lie. She felt seen, and in that, she found the fragile beginnings of freedom. That night, as they sat together in silence, she finally allowed herself to speak the words she had buried for too long. "You have given me back what I thought was lost forever," she whispered. He looked at her, his gaze steady as always, and answered simply, "No one should be lost alive." In that moment, their story shifted once again, no longer bound by necessity, but by truth strong enough to stand against an entire village. The days that followed were quieter, but the air in the village still pulsed with unease. The whispers did not vanish, only sank deeper, like snakes wading in tall grass. Yet within their home, something had changed forever. The widow, once a figure wrapped in silence and shadow, now moved with a softer strength. She no longer avoided his gaze, nor kept her distance at the fire. Instead, she began to speak of small things: the changing of the seasons, the sound of coyotes at night, the taste of bitter herbs that reminded her of her childhood. Each word was a thread, weaving a fragile bridge between them. The young man cherished these moments more than he dared to admit. He remembered the boy he had been, standing at her door trembling, believing he was walking into death. Now, sitting across from her in the warm glow of firelight, he realized he had walked into life. It was not an easy life, nor free of struggle, but it was real, a bond forged in silence, sacrifice, and defiance. He no longer saw her as the most feared widow. To him, she was the strongest soul he had ever known. One evening, he asked her why she had never left the village, why she had endured years of cruelty instead of starting anew elsewhere. She stared into the fire for a long while before answering. "Because running would mean their lies had power over me. I would rather stay and let them choke on their own fear than give them the victory of my absence." Her words struck him like iron. She had not only survived the cruelty of fate, but had chosen to stand against the cruelty of men. For him, her strength became a kind of compass. He realized that his marriage, once a desperate bargain to save his mother, had become the greatest turning point of his life. What he had thought was sacrifice had transformed into revelation. That dignity was not given, but claimed. And beside her, he began to understand that even in a land as merciless as the West, honor could still take root. The village might never accept her, but in his heart, the truth was clear. She was not cursed, not feared, not a shadow of death. She was the proof that resilience could outlive rumor, that truth could outlast lies. And in her presence, he felt stronger, as though together they could weather anything the world dared to throw their way. By the time another season rolled in, their lives had become inseparable. The widow was no longer a silent figure feared in the dark, and he was no longer the boy who had married her out of desperation. They had grown into something the village could not comprehend, a bond that defied rumor, that stood unshaken in the face of cruelty. Together, they carried the scars of the past, but instead of hiding them, they wore them like armor. One night, as the prairie stretched endlessly beneath the stars, he turned to her and said, "If I had to choose again, I would still walk to your door." She froze, her breath caught, for no one had ever spoken such words to her. For years she had been told she was cursed, feared, unwanted. Yet here, before her, stood a man who had chosen her, not for survival, not for duty, but because he saw her truth. And in that moment, something long buried within her finally broke free. She confessed then that she had once believed herself doomed to live and die in silence, never to be remembered except in whispers of fear. "But you," she said softly, "you gave me back a name worth carrying." Her voice trembled, but her eyes held steady. It was not a declaration of love in the way others might speak it, but in the Old West, words like these carried more weight than any vow. From that night forward, the bond between them was no longer fragile. It was iron, forged by fire and storm, unbroken by the weight of rumor. The villagers might never understand, might never see her truth, but it no longer mattered. In him, she had found recognition. In her, he had found strength. And together, they had carved out a story greater than the lies that once surrounded them. Thus ended the tale of the young man who married the most feared widow in the village, not as a story of tragedy, but as proof that even in the cruelest corners of the West, truth could survive. And sometimes, What begins as sacrifice grows into the kind of bond that neither time, nor death, nor whispers can destroy. In the unforgiving silence of the Old West, where dust buried names and whispers carried further than truth, their story stood apart. What began as a desperate act, a son marrying the most feared widow to save his sick mother, became a tale of endurance, dignity, and the kind of strength that refuses to be erased. Against the weight of rumor and the cruelty of fear, they found in each other not chains, but freedom. It was not a freedom given by the village, but one they carved for themselves, piece by piece, in the quiet strength of trust. The widow, once a figure cloaked in shadows, emerged as something more than the curses laid upon her name. She was proof that grief could be endured, that dignity could be reclaimed, that even the harshest judgment could not erase the truth of who she was. And the young man, who once believed himself a victim of fate, discovered that sacrifice could lead to strength, and strength to honor. Together, they rewrote a story the village had long tried to control, showing that resilience is stronger than fear. Their journey reminds us of something timeless, that people are rarely what the world claims them to be. Too often, lies shape the way others are seen, and fear becomes easier to believe than truth. But the boy who chose to stand by the widow proves a powerful lesson, that when we dare to see someone beyond their reputation, we uncover truths that change everything. What once seemed like a curse revealed itself as the deepest form of courage. Let this story settle in your thoughts, long after the fire has burned low. Ask yourself, how many around us live under the weight of lies, unseen for who they truly are? And how often do we mistake survival for cruelty, or grief for malice? The frontier may belong to another time, but the questions remain alive today. In the end, it is not whispers that define us, but the choices we make when faced with truth. If this story spoke to you, let your voice join it. Share your reflections in the comments. What did this tale awaken in you? Support the telling of stories like this by liking the video and subscribing to the channel, so together we can keep alive the lessons of resilience, dignity, and the kind of honor that even the harshest whispers can never silence.